In the modern American psyche, there is perhaps nothing we venerate quite as much as the disruptor. We are a culture built on the backs of visionaries who looked at broken, bloated, or obsolete systems and dared to say, "I can build something better." We see this spirit in the glass-walled offices of Silicon Valley, in the garage-born startups that became global empires, and in the revolutionary manifestos that have reshaped our economy. We worship at the altar of innovation, always looking for the next new thing that will render the old way irrelevant. But if we peel back the layers of history, past the era of the internet, past the Industrial Revolution, and past the birth of modern democracy, we find a disruption so profound that it makes our current technological leaps look like minor software patches. This was not a disruption of hardware or finance. It was a radical disruption of the human condition. It did not begin with a press release or a flashy keynote presentation. Instead, it began in a dusty, politically volatile corner of the Roman Empire. And it was documented by a man who spent his life analyzing data, tracking debts, and auditing the truth. To understand the Gospel of Matthew through a modern lens, we first have to recognize the legacy system that was running the world 2,000 years ago. Imagine a world where the user experience of spirituality was completely broken. On one side, you had the Roman Empire, a massive, monolithic hardware provider that controlled the physical world with an iron fist. They provided the roads and the security, but the subscription fee was crushing taxes and the total loss of personal liberty. On the other side, you had the religious establishment of the day, the Pharisees and Sadducees. If Rome was the hardware, these leaders were the gatekeepers of the API. They had taken the original, beautiful source code of the ancient laws and buried it under thousands of lines of legacy code. Complicated rituals, impossible standards, and religious red tape that made the Creator feel distant, judgmental, and inaccessible to the average person. The system was crashing. The people were overtaxed, underserved, and spiritually bankrupt. The market was desperate for a change, a new way of being, a version, too, of what it meant to be alive and connected to the divine. Enter the founder. He didn't come from the Ivy League schools of Jerusalem. He didn't have a massive marketing budget or the backing of the political elites. He was a carpenter from Nazareth, a flyover town that most people ignored. He was the ultimate bootstrapper. When this man, Jesus, stepped onto the scene, he didn't just suggest a few minor updates to the old system. He didn't try to negotiate with the gatekeepers. Instead, he proposed a total system wipe. He introduced something he called the Kingdom of Heaven, and it was the most disruptive operating system the world had ever seen. While the world's OS was built on power, accumulation, and eye for an eye logic, this new OS ran on a completely different logic: humility, radical empathy, and a user interface of love. It was a paradigm shift that challenged every existing power structure. It promised that the last would be first, that the meek would inherit the earth, and that true power was found in serving others rather than ruling them. For the establishment, this was a threat to their business model. For the common person, it was the update they had been waiting for their entire lives. But how do we know this story isn't just another piece of ancient marketing? This is where our narrator, Matthew, comes in. In the American business world, we rely on the auditor, the person who looks past the hype and examines the spreadsheets. Matthew was that man. Before he was a follower, he was a tax collector. He was a guy who understood big data. He spent his days in a booth, calculating exchange rates, documenting transactions, and ensuring every cent was accounted for. He wasn't a poet or a dreamer. He was a pragmatist who dealt in cold, hard facts. When he decided to write this account, he did so with the meticulousness of a lead developer writing a white paper. He didn't just want to tell a story. He wanted to prove, through historical cross-referencing and beta testing in the real world, that this Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. Matthew's account is the documentation for the revolution. It is a record of how a small, 1-2 person startup team of misfits and outsiders took this new OS and scaled it until it crashed the Roman Empire and rebranded Western civilization itself. As we walk through this narrative, we aren't just looking at a religious text, we are analyzing the blueprint of the ultimate comeback story. We are looking at how authenticity became the ultimate weapon against a corrupt establishment. In an age where we are constantly bombarded by fake influences, empty corporate jargon, and systems that feel like they are failing us, the greatest disruption recorded by Matthew feels more relevant than ever. It's a story about finding signal in the noise. It's about a leader who didn't want your data, he wanted your heart. So, whether you are a skeptic, a seeker, or someone just looking for a better way to navigate the complexities of modern life, I invite you to set aside your legacy thinking. Let's look at the data. Let's audit the evidence. Let's explore the Kingdom OS and see why, 2,000 years later, the world is still trying to catch up to the disruption that Matthew first put into words. This is not just history. This is the product launch that changed the world forever. When we think of the disciples of Jesus, the popular imagination often conjures up images of rugged fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, men of muscle and grit, salt of the earth types who lived by the tides and their instincts. We think of Peter's impulsive passion or John's poetic mysticism. But in the American corporate landscape, we have a saying that dictates how we truly make decisions. In God we trust. All others must bring data. This is where the story of the first gospel takes a fascinating, highly modern turn. If this movement was a global startup, Jesus didn't just need vision guys or frontline workers. He needed a quant. He needed someone who understood the ledger, someone who could track the KPIs of a prophecy, and someone whose entire career had been built on the cold, hard reality of the bottom line. He needed Matthew. To understand why Matthew, originally known as Levi, is the perfect narrator for a skeptical, results-oriented American audience, we have to look at his resume before he joined the movement. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman Empire. In the first century, this was perhaps the most hated profession in Judea, but it was also one of the most technically demanding. Matthew sat at a tax booth, which was essentially a data hub. He wasn't just a guy with a coin jar. He was an agent of the most sophisticated bureaucracy the world had ever seen. His job required him to be fluent in multiple languages, to understand complex international trade laws, to calculate exchange rates on the fly, and, most importantly, to be an expert in documentation. In a world of oral traditions and hearsay, Matthew was a man of the pen and the ledger. He lived in a world where a single error in a column could mean the difference between a promotion and a prison cell. He was trained to be precise, to be observant, and to be skeptical of everyone's estimated income. This background creates a unique data mindset that permeates every chapter of his gospel. For an American audience that values transparency and evidence, Matthew is the internal auditor of the New Testament. He didn't write his account to give us a vibe or a feeling about who Jesus was. He wrote it to prove, with the meticulousness of a forensic accountant, that Jesus was the exact fulfillment of a centuries-old source code, the Hebrew prophecies. When you read Matthew, you notice a recurring theme that functions like a digital hyperlink. He constantly uses the phrase, "This was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet." To a modern reader, this is Matthew performing a system validation. He is cross-referencing the real-time data of Jesus' life against the historical database of the Old Testament. He wanted his readers to see that this wasn't a random glitch in history. It was a planned deployment that matched every single specification of the original blueprint. Imagine the scene of his recruitment through a modern lens. Jesus walks up to the tax booth, the ancient equivalent of an IRS workstation, and says two words, "Follow me." For most people, this is a story of radical faith. But for a data guy like Matthew, it was also a calculated move. He had spent his life watching people. He saw the net worth of every person in town, but he also saw their moral deficit. He saw the corruption of Rome and the hypocrisy of the religious elites. He knew a bad asset when he saw one. Yet, in Jesus, Matthew saw something that didn't fit the usual metrics. He saw a leader with a value proposition that wasn't based on extraction, but on investment in human capital. When Matthew stood up and left his booth, he didn't leave his skills behind. He simply pivoted his analytical framework from tracking Roman denarii to tracking the kingdom currency of grace and truth. What makes Matthew's account so compelling for the American listener is his obsession with structure and organization. While other biographers might tell a story chronologically, Matthew organizes his gospel into 5 distinct modules or discourses. He understood that for a product to scale globally, it needed a clear user manual. He grouped the teachings of Jesus into logical blocks: the ethics of the kingdom, the mission of the disciples, the parables of growth, the nature of the church, and the vision of the future. This is strategic documentation at its finest. He was creating a knowledge base that could be exported from a small village in Galilee to the ends of the earth. He knew that vision without structure is just a dream, but vision with documentation is a movement. Furthermore, we must appreciate the resilience of Matthew's perspective. Because he had been a tax collector, he was a social outcast, cancelled by his own culture long before that term existed. He knew what it was like to be the villain in everyone else's story. This gave him a unique objectivity. He wasn't trying to win a popularity contest with his writing. He was interested in the truth of the transaction. In America, we often say, "The numbers don't lie." Matthew brought that same brutal honesty to his gospel. He didn't airbrush the failures of the other disciples, and he didn't shy away from the high cost of entry to follow Jesus. He presented the financial statement of discipleship with total transparency. It will cost you everything, but the return on investment is eternal. Matthew's data mindset also shows up in his attention to genealogy and lineage. The very first chapter of his book is a long list of names, a database of ancestry. To a modern reader, this might seem boring, but to an auditor like Matthew, this was the chain of title. He was proving the legal right of Jesus to sit on the throne of David. He was verifying the credentials of the CEO. He knew that in a world of pretenders, the pedigree mattered. He was showing that Jesus wasn't an unauthorized user of the messianic title. He was the primary account holder by birthright and by divine decree. Ultimately, Matthew serves as the chief documentation officer of the Christian movement. For the American who is tired of fake news and empty rhetoric, Matthew offers a fact-checked account of the most important life ever lived. He invites us to move beyond blind faith and into informed conviction. He asks us to look at the evidence logs, to audit the prophetic transactions, and to see for ourselves if the math of the gospel adds up. By the time you finish his account, Matthew isn't just asking you to believe a story. He is asking you to sign off on a life-changing audit. He proves that when a data analyst meets a visionary, the result is a record that can withstand the scrutiny of 2,000 years of history. This is the power of the auditor's perspective. It turns a moment into a legacy and a message into a manual for the world. When we think of the disciples of Jesus, the popular imagination often conjures up images of rugged fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, men of muscle and grit, salt-of-the-earth types, who lived by the tides and their instincts. We think of Peter's impulsive passion or John's poetic mysticism. But in the American corporate landscape, we have a saying that dictates how we truly make decisions. In God we trust. All others must bring data. This is where the story of the first gospel takes a fascinating, highly modern turn. If this movement was a global startup, Jesus didn't just need vision guys or frontline workers. He needed a quant. He needed someone who understood the ledger, someone who could track the KPIs of a prophecy, and someone whose entire career had been built on the cold, hard reality of the bottom line. He needed Matthew. To understand why Matthew, originally known as Levi, is the perfect narrator for a skeptical, results-oriented American audience, we have to look at his resume before he joined the movement. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman Empire. In the first century, this was perhaps the most hated profession in Judea, but it was also one of the most technically demanding. Matthew sat at a tax booth, which was essentially a data hub. He wasn't just a guy with a coin jar. He was an agent of the most sophisticated bureaucracy the world had ever seen. His job required him to be fluent in multiple languages, to understand complex international trade laws, to calculate exchange rates on the fly, and most importantly, to be an expert in documentation. In a world of oral traditions and hearsay, Matthew was a man of the pen and the ledger. He lived in a world where a single error in a column could mean the difference between a promotion and a prison cell. He was trained to be precise, to be observant, and to be skeptical of everyone's estimated income. This background creates a unique data mindset that permeates every chapter of his gospel. For an American audience that values transparency and evidence, Matthew is the internal auditor of the New Testament. He didn't write his account to give us a vibe or a feeling about who Jesus was. He wrote it to prove, with the meticulousness of a forensic accountant, that Jesus was the exact fulfillment of a centuries-old source code, the Hebrew prophecies. When you read Matthew, you notice a recurring theme that functions like a digital hyperlink. He constantly uses the phrase, "This was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet." To a modern reader, this is Matthew performing a system validation. He is cross-referencing the real-time data of Jesus' life against the historical database of the Old Testament. He wanted his readers to see that this wasn't a random glitch in history. It was a planned deployment that matched every single specification of the original blueprint. Imagine the scene of his recruitment through a modern lens. Jesus walks up to the tax booth, the ancient equivalent of an IRS workstation, and says two words, "Follow me." For most people, this is a story of radical faith, but for a data guy like Matthew, it was also a calculated move. He had spent his life watching people. He saw the net worth of every person in town, but he also saw their moral deficit. He saw the corruption of Rome and the hypocrisy of the religious elites. He knew a bad asset when he saw one. Yet, in Jesus, Matthew saw something that didn't fit the usual metrics. He saw a leader with a value proposition that wasn't based on extraction, but on investment in human capital. When Matthew stood up and left his booth, he didn't leave his skills behind. He simply pivoted his analytical framework from tracking Roman denarii to tracking the kingdom currency of grace and truth. What makes Matthew's account so compelling for the American listener is his obsession with structure and organization. While other biographers might tell a story chronologically, Matthew organizes his gospel into 5 distinct modules or discourses. He understood that for a product to scale globally, it needed a clear user manual. He grouped the teachings of Jesus into logical blocks: the ethics of the kingdom, the mission of the disciples, the parables of growth, the nature of the church, and the vision of the future. This is strategic documentation at its finest. He was creating a knowledge base that could be exported from a small village in Galilee to the ends of the earth. He knew that vision without structure is just a dream, but vision with documentation is a movement. Furthermore, we must appreciate the resilience of Matthew's perspective. Because he had been a tax collector, he was a social outcast, cancelled by his own culture long before that term existed. He knew what it was like to be the villain in everyone else's story. This gave him a unique objectivity. He wasn't trying to win a popularity contest with his writing. He was interested in the truth of the transaction. In America, we often say, "The numbers don't lie." Matthew brought that same brutal honesty to his gospel. He didn't airbrush the failures of the other disciples, and he didn't shy away from the high cost of entry to follow Jesus. He presented the financial statement of discipleship with total transparency. It will cost you everything, but the return on investment is eternal. Matthew's data mindset also shows up in his attention to genealogy and lineage. The very first chapter of his book is a long list of names, a database of ancestry. To a modern reader, this might seem boring, but to an auditor like Matthew, this was the chain of title. He was proving the legal right of Jesus to sit on the throne of David. He was verifying the credentials of the CEO. He knew that in a world of pretenders, the pedigree mattered. He was showing that Jesus wasn't an unauthorized user of the messianic title. He was the primary account holder by birthright and by divine decree. Ultimately, Matthew serves as the chief documentation officer of the Christian movement. For the American who is tired of fake news and empty rhetoric, Matthew offers a fact-checked account of the most important life ever lived. He invites us to move beyond blind faith and into informed conviction. He asks us to look at the evidence logs, to audit the prophetic transactions, and to see for ourselves if the math of the gospel adds up. By the time you finish his account, Matthew isn't just asking you to believe a story, he is asking you to sign off on a life-changing audit. He proves that when a data analyst meets a visionary, the result is a record that can withstand the scrutiny of 2,000 years of history. This is the power of the auditor's perspective. It turns a moment into a legacy and a message into a manual for the world. In the modern American landscape of high-stakes business and elite performance, we are obsessed with the A-team. We are told that if you want to build a world-changing organization, you go to the Ivy Leagues. You recruit the MBAs from Harvard, the tech geniuses from Stanford, and the silver-tongued lobbyists from DC. We have been conditioned to believe that the quality of the human capital you acquire on day one determines the ceiling of your success. Our HR departments are armed with personality tests, background checks, and rigorous multi-round interviews designed to filter out the misfits and find the perfect fits. But as Matthew records in the third major movement of his account, the greatest movement in human history was built on a recruitment strategy that would be considered professional suicide in any modern boardroom. Jesus, the founder, didn't go to the religious headquarters in Jerusalem to find his C-suite. He didn't look for the most polished or the most popular. Instead, he went to the docks and the tax booths, choosing a team of misfits who were not only underqualified, but were, in many cases, culturally incompatible with one another. To appreciate the sheer audacity of this talent acquisition strategy, we have to look at the roster through the eyes of an auditor like Matthew. Matthew knew the market value of people better than anyone. He understood that in the eyes of the establishment, his colleagues, the fishermen, like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, were unskilled labor. These were blue-collar guys. They were rough around the edges, likely smelled of salt and fish, and had tempers that flared as quickly as a storm on the Sea of Galilee. They were men of action, not men of letters. In a society that venerated religious scholarship, they were outsiders. Yet Jesus saw something in them that an HR algorithm would miss: grit. He saw men who knew how to work through the night when the harvest was slim. He saw men who understood teamwork and who weren't afraid of a little market volatility. By recruiting them, he wasn't looking for subject matter experts. He was looking for cultural carriers, people whose lives were defined by resilience rather than reputation. But the recruitment strategy got even more controversial when Jesus walked up to Matthew's own tax booth. As we discussed earlier, Matthew was the villain. In the American context, imagine a revolutionary leader trying to win the hearts of the working class by hiring a predatory hedge fund manager or a disgraced politician as his chief financial officer. It was a PR nightmare. By hiring Matthew, Jesus was introducing a toxic asset into the group. The fishermen would have hated Matthew. He represented the system that exploited their labor. And yet, this is where the disruption becomes truly radical. Jesus wasn't just building a team, he was building a laboratory of reconciliation. He brought together the fisherman, the exploited, and the tax collector, the exploiter, and told them to run on the same operating system. This is a masterclass in diversity and inclusion that goes far deeper than modern corporate slogans. It was about taking people from polar opposite ends of the social and political spectrum and fusing them together through a shared vision. Consider the inclusion of Simon the Zealot. In the first century, a zealot was essentially a political insurgent, someone committed to the violent overthrow of the Roman occupation. So, in one small group, you had Matthew, who worked for Rome, and Simon, who wanted to kill people like Matthew. This was a team of rivals that would make Abraham Lincoln's cabinet look like a friendly dinner party. Why would a visionary leader intentionally design a team with such high internal friction? Because Jesus knew that if his kingdom OS could work for this group of misfits, it could work for anyone. He was stress testing his message in the most difficult environment possible. If grace could bridge the gap between a zealot and a tax collector, it could bridge the gap between any two humans on earth. The recruitment wasn't about finding people who were already good. It was about finding people who were willing to be transformed. For the American listener who feels like they don't fit the mold of traditional success, this chapter of Matthew's record is incredibly liberating. It suggests that the founder is more interested in your will than your resume. In the tech world, we often talk about hire for attitude, train for skill. Jesus took this to the ultimate level. He took misfits and put them through a 3-year, intensive, on-the-job training program. He didn't give them a handbook and a desk. He gave them his life. He walked with them, ate with them, and allowed them to fail loudly and frequently. Matthew records these failures with brutal honesty because he wanted us to see the beta testing phase of the disciples. He shows us Peter's cowardice, the disciples' lack of faith, and their constant bickering over who was the greatest, a very American obsession, mind you. By documenting their flaws, Matthew proves that the power of the movement didn't come from the quality of the hires, but from the quality of the leadership. This recruitment model also highlights a fundamental shift in power dynamics. In the old system, power was top-down. You climbed the ladder to get to the top. But Jesus introduced a flat organization based on servant leadership. He told his team of misfits, "The greatest among you will be your servant." This was a complete user interface overhaul. He was training them not to be managers of a religion, but stewards of a revolution. He was teaching them that in the Kingdom OS, your ranking is determined by your level of sacrifice. For a group of men who were used to being at the bottom of the social ladder, this was an intoxicating and revolutionary concept. They weren't just employees. They were co-founders of a new world. As the story progresses, we see the scaling of this team. These 12 men, plus a few dozen other early adopters, were the ones tasked with the global rollout of the message. From a venture capital perspective, the burn rate was high. Most of them would eventually give their lives for the cause. But the return on investment was staggering. Within a few generations, this misfit startup had bypassed the Roman legacy system and become the dominant cultural force in the Western world. They didn't do it through market share or military might. They did it through the sheer viral power of a message that was lived out by people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Matthew, the auditor, records all of this because he wants us to see the logistics of grace. He wants us to see that the kingdom of heaven isn't an exclusive club for the elites. It's an open source project for the broken. When he looks back at the day he left his tax booth, he doesn't see a career change. He sees a redemption of talent. He sees a leader who took his ability to record and his eye for detail and repurposed it for a mission that actually mattered. For every American sitting in a cubicle today, feeling like their skills are being wasted on small data, Matthew's story is a job posting for something greater. It's an invitation to join the misfits and build something that doesn't just show up on a quarterly report, but echoes in eternity. The recruitment continues today, and the only requirement for the interview is a willingness to leave your legacy booth behind and follow the disruptor into the unknown. This is how the world is changed, not by the A players of the status quo, but by the misfits of the new kingdom. In the history of innovation, there are moments that define an era. Product launches that don't just introduce a new gadget, but fundamentally alter how we interact with reality. For the modern American, we think of the 2007 iPhone launch, where the world's user interface shifted from buttons to touch. We think of the mother of all demos in 1968 that predicted the future of personal computing. These are keynote moments. But the most significant keynote ever delivered didn't happen in a convention center in San Francisco or a glass-walled theater in Cupertino. It happened on a grassy hillside in Galilee. It was here that the founder, Jesus, stood before a crowd of early adopters and delivered what we now call the Sermon on the Mount. To the auditor Matthew, this wasn't just a collection of nice sayings or inspirational quotes for a social media feed. This was the unveiling of Kingdom OS 2. It was a total system architecture redesign, moving away from the legacy code of outward ritual and introducing a new internal logic for the human soul. The legacy system, which we call the old law, was functional. It provided the basic firewalls of morality: don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. It kept society from crashing into total anarchy. But it was bloatware. Over centuries, it had become heavy, burdened by thousands of lines of legalistic subroutines added by religious gatekeepers. It focused entirely on the front end, what people could see. If you didn't break a rule physically, your status was green. But the founder saw that the back end, the human heart, was riddled with bugs, malware, and corrupted files of anger, lust, and greed. In this historic keynote, Jesus introduced a new architecture. He didn't come to delete the old code. He came to fulfill it, to optimize it, so that the law didn't just sit on stone tablets, but ran natively in the processor of the human heart. He began this launch with a set of core features that we call the Beatitudes. For an American audience obsessed with hustle culture and personal branding, these features are shockingly counterintuitive. They are the ultimate system disruption. The first feature of Kingdom OS 2 is poor in spirit. In our self-made American mythology, we are told that the admin rights to the kingdom belong to the confident, the wealthy, and the self-sufficient. We are taught to project strength at all costs. But the founder's first spec is an identity reset. To be poor in spirit means to acknowledge that your internal resources are at zero. It is the installation requirement for the new OS. You cannot download the kingdom if your internal storage is already full of your own ego. It is the radical admission that we don't have the computation power to save ourselves. In the world of tech, this is zero-based budgeting for the soul. The founder says that when you admit you have nothing, you suddenly have access to everything. The kingdom of heaven becomes your cloud storage, providing infinite resources that your own local drive could never hold. The second feature is mourning. This seems like a system error. Why would a blessing include sorrow? In a culture that spends billions on user experience designed to distract us from pain, Jesus introduces deep empathy as a core function. This feature allows the user to process the error logs of a broken world. To mourn is to have a heart that breaks for what breaks the founder's heart. It is the telemetry of the soul, sensing the suffering of others and the system failures of injustice. Jesus promises that those who mourn will be comforted. This isn't just a platitude, it's a feedback loop. When we allow ourselves to feel the brokenness, we trigger the system's healing protocols. In an America that is increasingly lonely and numb, the ability to mourn is a feature upgrade that restores our humanity. The third feature is meekness. This is perhaps the most misunderstood specification in the entire keynote. In our alpha male culture, meekness is often confused with weakness or system lag. But in the original source code, meekness means power under control. Think of it as a governor on a high-performance engine. It is the ability to possess a Ferrari level of influence, but to drive it at the school zone speed of humility. It is user permissions exercised with restraint. The founder says the meek will inherit the earth, while the legacy OS says you get the earth through aggressive acquisition and hostile takeovers. Kingdom OS 2 says you inherit it through gentle stewardship. It is the ultimate long-term investment strategy. The fourth feature is hunger and thirst for righteousness. This is the growth hacking of the spirit. Most of us hunger for market share, social validation, or financial liquidity. But the founder redirects our optimization drive. He says, "Blessed are those who crave integrity." This feature is about code quality. It's a relentless desire to see the output of your life match the value statements of the kingdom. It's about wanting things to be right as much as we want our next meal. When this feature is active, the user stops looking for workarounds to moral problems and starts seeking system-wide justice. The reward isn't a trophy, it's satisfaction, the deep, internal completion that comes from living a life of high fidelity to the truth. The fifth feature is mercy. In a world of cancel culture and recursive grudges, mercy is the system-wide undo button. The legacy OS runs on a Boolean logic of I for an I, an if, then statement that demands a packet of revenge for every packet of offense. This creates an infinite loop of conflict. Mercy bends the code. It is the algorithm of forgiveness that breaks the cycle of retaliation. The founder warns that this feature is symmetrical. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. If you want your system to receive patches for your own mistakes, you must be willing to patch the mistakes of others. It is the peer-to-peer sharing of grace that prevents the entire network from crashing into bitterness. The sixth feature is purity of heart. This is about clean UI, UX. In the legacy system, people spent all their time polishing the front end, while the back end was filled with malicious scripts of hidden agendas and double-mindedness. Purity of heart is single-mindedness. It is a system audit that removes the pop-ups of ego and the adware of seeking human praise. To be pure in heart is to have a user intent that is 100% aligned with the founder. Jesus says, "These users will see God." When the static of self-interest is removed, the resolution of our spiritual vision increases. We start to see the divine signature in everything. It is the high-definition experience of reality. The seventh feature is peacemaking. Notice, the founder doesn't say, peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is just a system idle state where you ignore problems to avoid conflict. Peacemaking is an active protocol. It is the work of interoperability, bringing two incompatible systems together and creating a bridge. In a divided America, where we are polarized by firewalls of politics, race, and class, peacemakers are the network engineers of the kingdom. They are the ones who do the hard work of conflict resolution and reconciliation. The founder says they will be called sons of God because they are doing the family business. They are replicating the founder's own API of bringing heaven and earth back into sync. Finally, the eighth feature is the most challenging: persecution. This is the security protocol. The founder is being transparent. He's giving us the risk disclosure. When you run Kingdom OS 2 inches, a world still running the legacy OS, there will be system conflicts. The old system will try to uninstall you. It will flag you as a threat. It will try to DDoS your reputation with spam and lies. But Jesus says, rejoice. Why? Because if the world system is attacking you, it's a validation that your OS is working. It means you are a threat to the status quo. It means your version is the future. The end-user license agreement of the kingdom includes a warranty of eternal joy that no earthly crash can void. As Matthew records the rest of the keynote, we see how these features translate into real-world performance. Jesus tells his followers they are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. In marketing terms, this is the brand identity. Salt preserves and enhances flavor. Light exposes the truth and guides the way. He isn't asking them to try to be salt and light. He is stating their functional reality. If you are running the OS, this is your output. If the salt loses its savor, if the OS becomes corrupted by the values of the old system, it loses its market value. If the light is hidden under a bushel, if the display is turned off, it fails its core mission. The Sermon on the Mount concludes with a call to action that every American can appreciate: the foundation test. Jesus says that listening to his keynote, but not installing it into your life, is like building a house on sand. It looks good during sunny market cycles, but when the system stress test, the storm comes, the architecture will collapse. But the one who hears and acts, the one who deploys the code, is like a wise builder who builds on the rock. This is about structural integrity. It's about a life that doesn't crash when the economic winds blow or personal tragedies strike. For the American listener, chapter 4 of Matthew's account is the venture capitalist's dream. It's the pitch deck for a new humanity. It challenges our hustle, our ego, and our self-reliance. It offers a system upgrade that promises not just better performance, but a better purpose. It asks us, are you tired of the legacy system? Are you ready to update your life? The Kingdom OS 2 is ready for download, but it requires a full system reset. As Matthew would say, the data is clear, the old way is obsolete, the future is here, and it's running on the logic of the mountaintop keynote. Are you ready to log in? In the world of American enterprise, a visionary keynote is only as good as the product demo that follows it. We are a nation of skeptics and pragmatists. We don't just want to hear a CEO talk about a revolutionary new software, we want to see it run. We want to see it handle the edge cases, survive the stress tests, and, most importantly, we want to see it solve real-world pain points. In the tech hubs of Austin, Seattle, and Silicon Valley, a product only achieves product-market fit when it proves it can fix a problem that users are actually facing. As Matthew transitions from the keynote of the Sermon on the Mount into the active ministry of Jesus, he shifts his auditor's focus from theory to functionality. In chapter 5 of our story, we look at the miracles of Jesus not as magic tricks or religious spectacles, but as the ultimate product testing phase. To Matthew, these weren't just supernatural flashes, they were bug fixes for a corrupted human hardware. He was documenting how Kingdom OS 2 provides tangible solutions to the most agonizing user errors of our existence: sickness, hunger, isolation, and fear. The first pain point the founder addresses is social and physical marginalization. In Matthew chapter 8, immediately after coming down from the mountain, Jesus encounters a leper. In the legacy system of first-century Judea, a leper was the ultimate broken file. They were uninstalled from society, forced to live in quarantine mode, and considered corrupted data that no one was allowed to touch. The legacy code said, "Distance yourself or be defiled." But Jesus performs a system override. He doesn't just heal the man with a word, he reaches out and touches him. This is a radical user interface shift. By touching the untouchable, Jesus is testing the inclusivity protocol of the kingdom. He is proving that the new OS doesn't just fix the physical hardware, the skin disease. It repairs the social connectivity, the isolation. For a modern American audience dealing with an epidemic of loneliness and social cancellation, this miracle is a validation that the founder's solution is designed to reintegrate those who have been flagged as outcasts. Matthew, the former tax collector who was once an outcast himself, records this with a subject matter expert's appreciation. He knew what it felt like to be a system error in the eyes of the public, and he saw in this miracle a feature that offered total restoration. Next, the founder tests the scalability and remote access of his authority through the story of the Roman centurion. This is a fascinating case for the American listener because the centurion is a middle manager in the Roman corporation. He understands standard operating procedures. He tells Jesus, "I am a man under authority. I say to this one, go," and he goes. The centurion is essentially asking for a remote update. He doesn't need Jesus to physicalize the solution by visiting his house. He believes in the network speed of the founder's word. Jesus is blown away by this user feedback. He calls it the greatest faith, or system confidence, he has seen. This product test proves that Kingdom OS 2 isn't limited by local latency or geographic boundaries. It's a cloud-based authority that works across any network. For an American culture that pioneered the remote work and global connectivity revolution, this miracle resonates as a proof of concept that the kingdom's power isn't confined to a physical server. It is a universal access solution that responds to high-fidelity trust anywhere on the planet. But what about environmental instability? Americans are all too familiar with market volatility and unforeseen disruptions. In Matthew 8:23, the founder takes his core team onto a boat, and a system-wide crash, a massive storm, occurs. The disciples, running on their legacy OS of fear, go into system panic. They wake the founder, shouting that they are about to crash. Jesus, however, is in safe mode. He's sleeping. When he wakes, he doesn't just troubleshoot their fear. He reboots the environment. He mutes the wind and the waves. Matthew records the disciples' reaction. What kind of man is this? This wasn't just a weather hack. This was a stress test, proving that the king has admin rights over the physical infrastructure of the world. It showed that when external volatility reaches a critical peak, the Kingdom OS provides an internal stability that can actually override the chaos. In a world of climate anxiety and economic turmoil, this product test offers a value proposition of unshakable peace. Perhaps the most famous product test of all is the resource optimization demo, commonly known as the feeding of the 5,000. From a supply chain perspective, this is a nightmare. You have 5,000 users, plus women and children, and only 5 data units, loaves, and 2 assets, fish. The disciples' legacy analytics tell them to terminate the session and send the people away because the input doesn't match the demand. But Jesus performs a multiplication algorithm. He takes the limited resources, optimizes them through the kingdom protocol, and suddenly there is a surplus. Everyone is filled, and there are 12 baskets of redundant data left over. For the American entrepreneurial spirit, this is the ultimate growth hack. It proves that in the Kingdom OS, scarcity is a user illusion. When limited assets are placed in the founder's hands, they scale beyond linear logic. This miracle addresses the pain point of insecurity and resource depletion, proving that the kingdom supply chain is infinite and robust. Matthew, the auditor, meticulously documents these tests because he knows that for his B2B, business to believer, white paper to be credible, the evidence logs must be ironclad. He doesn't present these miracles as anomalies, but as features of the new reality. He wants the reader to see that Jesus isn't just fixing bugs. He is redefining the system requirements of life. Every blind man who receives vision restoration, every paralytic who gets a hardware mobility upgrade, and every demoniac who receives a system cleanup from malicious software serves as empirical evidence that Kingdom OS 2 is functional, stable, and superior to anything else on the market. For the modern American listener, this chapter is the validation phase of the story. It moves the conversation from philosophy to performance. It asks us, if you are dealing with a pain point in your life, whether it's a broken heart, a corrupted habit, or a resource crisis, why are you still trying to troubleshoot it with legacy tools? Matthew's audit proves that the founder has the solutions that actually deploy in the real world. The miracles are the beta test results that show the kingdom isn't just a concept, it's a working model of a restored humanity. It invites us to stop speculating and start testing the OS for ourselves. As the demo concludes, the data is undeniable. The founder can handle the load, the product is live, the disruption is verified. And for those willing to onboard, the solutions are as real today as they were on the testing grounds of Galilee. This is the power of miracles. As solutions, they turn skeptics into users, and users into advocates for the greatest disruption in history. In the American business landscape, there is a recurring phenomenon known as the hostile takeover. It happens when a disruptive force enters the market and begins to threaten the monopoly of a legacy corporation. The established giants who have controlled the market share for decades don't just sit back and watch their influence evaporate. They use every tool at their disposal: legal challenges, PR smear campaigns, and regulatory red tape to crush the newcomer. They aren't interested in innovation, they are interested in market preservation. As Matthew enters the middle and late stages of his account, he documents a spiritual hostile takeover. The legacy corporation in this story is the religious elite, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the disruptor is Jesus. This isn't just a theological debate. It's a high-stakes conflict over who owns the identity of the people. To Matthew, the auditor, this section of the story is an exposure of bad assets. He records how the founder unmasked the virtue signaling of the elites and replaced it with a business model of radical authenticity. For a modern American audience that is increasingly cynical about corporate jargon and performative leadership, this chapter is a masterclass in how to identify and dismantle the whitewashed tombs of our own era. To understand the intensity of this conflict, we must first look at the market dominance of the Pharisees. In the first century, they were the gatekeepers of the API. If you wanted to connect with God, you had to go through their protocols. They had built a massive regulatory framework known as the tradition of the elders. It was essentially bloatware, thousands of minute, pedantic rules that made life miserable for the average user. They controlled the access keys to righteousness, and they used that power to maintain a social monopoly. But as the auditor, Matthew, notes, their internal ledgers didn't match their public filings. They were profit-driven, seeking the best seats in the synagogues and the social validation of the marketplace, while their hearts were bankrupt of actual compassion. Jesus entered this environment as a whistleblower. He didn't just challenge their rules, he challenged their character integrity. He began a hostile takeover, not of their buildings, but of the hearts of the people they were supposed to serve. One of the most frequent battlegrounds in this conflict was the Sabbath. In the legacy OS, the Sabbath had become a compliance nightmare. The elites had added so many subroutines to the law that it was almost impossible for a normal person to rest without system error. When Jesus and his disciples began harvesting grain on the Sabbath because they were hungry, the Pharisees flagged it as a violation of terms of service. Jesus' response was a platform-level disruption. He looked at the gatekeepers and said, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." In modern terms, he was saying, "I own the platform. I wrote the code." The Sabbath was created as a user benefit, not as a user burden. He then performed a live demo by healing a man with a withered hand, proving that system maintenance, doing good, is always in scope, even on a rest day. For the American listener who feels burnt out by the constant productivity metrics of modern life, this is a revolutionary policy update. It shows a leader who prioritizes the well-being of the user over the rigidity of the process. As the conflict escalated, Jesus delivered what can only be described as the most brutal audit in history, the 7 woes of Matthew 23. In the tech world, we might call this a system-wide vulnerability report. Jesus stands in the middle of the temple, the corporate headquarters, and publicly deconstructs the hypocrisy of the leadership. He calls them blind guides and hypocrites. The word hypocrite in the original Greek, hypocrites, refers to a stage actor, someone who wears a mask. Jesus was accusing the elites of brand fraud. He said they strain out a gnat but swallow a camel, meaning they were obsessed with minor compliance issues while ignoring major system failures like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He was calling out their virtue signaling before the term even existed. The most stinging metaphor he used was the whitewashed tomb. He told the elites they were like beautiful marble monuments that looked clean and professional on the front end, but on the back end, they were full of dead men's bones and system corruption. This is the ultimate audit failure. It's a balance sheet that looks healthy, but is actually hiding toxic debt. For an American audience that has seen the collapse of Enron-style corporations and the exposure of fake influencers, this message hits home. We are a culture that is starving for authenticity. We are tired of polished UIs that hide broken systems. Jesus' hostile takeover was a demand for transparency. He wasn't looking for performance art. He was looking for functional integrity. He told the people, do what they say, but don't do what they do. He was unlinking the message from the corrupted messenger. Matthew, the auditor, records these confrontations with a witness's accuracy. Remember, as a former tax collector, Matthew had likely been audited by these same Pharisees many times. He had been the outcast they looked down upon. He had seen their arrogance from the bottom up. By documenting Jesus' takeover, Matthew is showing that the Kingdom OS is anti-fragile. It doesn't break when it's challenged. It becomes clearer. The conflict with the elites serves as a contrast ratio. The darker and more hypocritical the Pharisees became, the brighter and more authentic Jesus' leadership appeared. It was a battle of the brands, and the brand of grace was winning the hearts and minds of the users. The lesson of this hostile takeover for the modern American listener is the value of the inside-out approach. In our hustle culture, we are often tempted to optimize our image while neglecting our infrastructure. We spend hours on our LinkedIn profiles and Instagram feeds trying to look like the ideal professional or the perfect parent. We whitewash our own tombs, but the founder of the kingdom warns us that image is a depreciating asset. The only thing that survives a system stress test is authenticity. Jesus' conflict with the elites tells us that true leadership isn't about controlling the access keys, it's about empowering the users. It's not about ritual compliance, it's about relational connection. As the chapter draws to a close, the legacy corporation realizes they cannot win the market competition. They cannot out-argue Jesus, and they cannot outperform him in product demos, miracles. So, they move from legal strategy to termination strategy. They begin to plot a final shutdown, the crucifixion. But what they didn't realize was that the founder had already planned for this exit event. He knew that the hostile takeover would require a total sacrifice. He was willing to let the legacy system destroy his physical hardware because he knew his software was already synced to the cloud. For us today, the conflict with the elites is a reminder that authenticity is the most disruptive force in the world. When you choose to be real in a world of fakes, you are running the Kingdom OS. When you prioritize people over processes, you are disrupting the market. Matthew's audit encourages us to examine our own internal ledgers. Are we whitewashed tombs, or are we living systems of grace? The hostile takeover of the heart is the only merger that actually yields eternal dividends. It is the great unmasking that leads to true freedom. As the founder showed us, the old guard might win the tactical battle of the moment, but the strategic victory belongs to those who live in the light of the truth. This is the end game of the disruption, a world where the mask is off and the king is in. In the American corporate lexicon, the term exit strategy usually refers to the ultimate goal of any high-stakes venture. It's the moment of the big payday, the IPO, or the lucrative acquisition by a larger conglomerate. It is the point where the founders finally cash out and move on to their next project. But as Matthew brings his meticulously audited account of Jesus to its climax, he documents an exit strategy that completely defies the logic of Wall Street. For the founder of the kingdom, the exit didn't look like a celebration in a boardroom. It looked like a catastrophic system failure. To the outside observer, the crucifixion of Jesus was the ultimate shutdown. The CEO was executed, the core team was in hiding, and the stock price of the movement had hit absolute zero. In the eyes of the Roman monopoly and the religious gatekeepers, the disruption was over. The Misfit startup from Galilee had been delisted, but as we have learned throughout Matthew's record, this founder specializes in system reboots. The exit was not the end of the story. It was the alpha phase for a global rollout that would eventually scale to every corner of the planet. The resurrection, which Matthew documents in chapter 28, is the ultimate validation of the code. In the tech world, if a piece of software claims to be unbreakable but crashes under pressure, it's a failure. But the founder had claimed to have admin rights over life and death itself. The resurrection was the final audit that proved his value proposition was 100% accurate. When the women arrived at the tomb and found it empty, and when the resurrected Jesus appeared to his disciples, it wasn't just a happy ending, it was the final proof of concept. It proved that the Kingdom OS wasn't just a better way to live. It was a new reality that death itself could not uninstall. For an American audience that values results and durability, the resurrection is the stress test that guarantees the system's reliability. It proved that the investment the disciples had made was the most secure asset in history. With the code verified and the founder vindicated, the story moves into its final most ambitious phase, the global scale, up. This is known as the Great Commission, and for the modern listener, it functions as the ultimate franchising agreement. Jesus meets his remaining team on a mountain, returning to the same kind of keynote environment where he first launched the OS and delivers the strategic mandate for the future. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." In modern business terms, he was delegating the authority and expanding the territory. He was telling his 11 remaining regional managers that the beta test in Judea was over. It was time for a global launch. This franchising model was revolutionary. Usually, a movement dies when the leader leaves, but Jesus was decentralizing the power. He didn't tell them to build a corporate headquarters in Jerusalem and wait for people to come to them. He told them to go. He was turning every follower into a user developer, someone who could install the Kingdom OS in their own culture, language, and community. He was giving them the master API and telling them to integrate it everywhere. This is why Christianity became the most scalable movement in history. It wasn't tied to a specific hardware, a building, or a country. It was a software solution that could run on any human processor. Matthew, the auditor, records this with a sense of global vision. He began his book with a genealogy that connected Jesus to the past, and he ends it with a commission that connects Jesus to every person's future. The terms of the agreement were simple but profound, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. This was about quality control. For a franchise to work, the customer experience must be consistent. Whether you were in Rome, Athens, or Ephesus, the output of a kingdom follower had to be the same. The Beatitudes in action, the radical empathy, the inside-out authenticity. Jesus wasn't just looking for market share, converts. He was looking for high-performance users, disciples, who would live out the core specs of the OS. He knew that the viral growth of the movement would depend on the authenticity of the people running the code. Finally, the founder delivers the closing line of the Bark Through white paper, a promise that provides the infrastructure for the entire future of the movement. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. This is the move from local server to cloud presence. Jesus was telling them that although his physical hardware would no longer be visible, his presence would be always online. He was providing 24/7 technical support through the Spirit. For the American entrepreneur or leader who feels the weight of scaling a mission alone, this is the ultimate assurance policy. The founder isn't just exiting and leaving us with a manual. He is remaining embedded in the system itself. Matthew's gospel ends here, but the log continues in the lives of those who read it. As we conclude our audit of this 2,000-year-old disruption, we are left with a choice. We have seen the data, we have analyzed the recruitment, we have studied the keynote, and we have verified the exit strategy. The question Matthew poses to us today is the same one he faced at his tax booth. Will you stay in the legacy system, or will you onboard to the kingdom? In a world that often feels like it's crashing, Matthew's record offers a stable build for a new life. It's a story of how a misfit startup changed the world, and an invitation to become part of the global scale-up. The founder is still online, the OS is still updating, and the kingdom is still the most disruptive force on earth. The audit is complete. The data is in. Now, it's time to execute the code.